All right, we're going to get started momentarily. If folks want to make their way to a seat, you can refill your coffee and bring it in the sanctuary, which is an incredible gift, and I want to come to this church. But the coffee is in the fellowship hall. If you want to grab one, we'll get started soon.
We are allowed in the sanctuary, is that what you said?
We are allowed, yes. It's quite something. Lisa, do you want to sit in the front row here?
Sure.
All right. If you want to sit over here, there's some chairs. The chairs have arms between the seats. There's one.
Lovely. Thank you. Got it.
Okay, great. I'll be sitting next to you in a moment. Could you hear me anyway? The people watching on the live stream could not. It is working now, I think.
Okay, there.
It could be turned up volume. There we go. All right. We'll try again. Hi. I'm Brian Ellison. I'm Executive Director of the Covenant Network of Presbyterians. So glad to have you all here. It is an honor and a privilege to share in community with you. These Covenant Conversations are an event that we have held. This is, I think, the 12th Covenant Conversation we've held around the country. We've had them in Sacramento and Chicago. We've had them in Nebraska and Oklahoma. We've had them in Southern California and Olympia, Washington. All over this country, communities, congregations coming together to talk about what inclusion of LGBTQIA plus people, what authentic welcome and affirmation look like, and how they can take the next steps in that journey. And so thank you for being part of this event. The theme that this planning team has worked together on is the courage to be transformed. And I'm excited about how we might find together that courage and find some practical help in taking those steps today. There's a few folks who I want to help set that tone and welcome you, and so I want to start by calling on my friend and colleague, the Reverend Matt Gaventa, who is co-moderator of the Board of Directors of the Covenant Network of Presbyterians, to say a word of welcome.
Thank you. Your applause is noted. Good morning, friends. My name is Matt Gaventa. I am one of the co-moderators of the Board of the Covenant Network, along with my colleague Slats Toole, who will be on the panel in just a bit and will get to introduce themselves then. I am also senior pastor at University Presbyterian Church in Austin, Texas, and I'm really delighted to be here and experience fall, which is not something that is normally available to me. I bring you greetings on behalf of the Covenant Network, on its board, of its 27 years of ministry and advocacy and witness in the denomination, and its 450 member congregations. And I'm very delighted that we can take this time this morning to do the next step of this work together. A little bit about my story. I am a cis straight white man and graduated seminary in 2012. In 2010, about this time of the year, went for candidacy before the Presbytery of the James in Virginia. And I went on the same day that the Presbytery of the James was voting on the approval of Amendment 10A. So for the morning, the Presbytery of the James argued and wrestled and debated and forefought themselves into a straight deadlocked tie. 152 to 152, the vote was announced. Amendment fails. Then there was lunch, and then there was me. And that moment sort of felt like a metaphor for my early ministry, in a sense, that I felt for a while through the lens of my own privilege of being and of timing, that I had come into a denomination that had just after it had sorted all of these things out, and that the work that I was going to do was going to be whatever was next. And the reality, as you all know this morning, is that instead the work very much continues. That even though the denomination has sorted out in some ways the major struggles of its polity, the work of inclusion at the congregational level, at the grassroots level, at the level of the real church and the real lives of real people very much continues. And so we are here because, in the language that my church has adopted, we are still striving for inclusivity. That the language in our website and our bulletin says that we are striving to be fully inclusive because we know that the work is always just a little bit ahead of us. And so I want to thank you all for being here today and for committing to that. It is sometimes easy for progressive or progressive identifying churches to get in a place where we decide that we have sort of got it figured out a little bit. And I want to applaud the work that we've done and also recognize the work that is still left undone and the work that still continues. And so thank you all for being here this morning to acknowledge that, to further it, and to be part of the commitment of the denomination to continually striving to get this a little better. So thank you for that. And I want to introduce now someone that many of you will know better than me. The Reverend Libby Shannon is the interim presbytery executive here in Twin Cities Area Presbytery, and she's going to bring a word of greeting for you all as well. So thank you.
Friends, good morning. It is a delight to see you all this morning and to be with you in this time. Hi, kiddo. My name is Libby Shannon, and I serve as transitional executive presbyter here in the Presbytery of the Twin Cities area with my faithful assistant, Kit. We have been here about 2 years, and in the 2 years that I have been in this presbytery, one of the things that has continually been at the fore is our history. Our history here in the Twin Cities area and throughout Minnesota, but also the history of this presbytery's relationship with justice and inclusion, the history of this presbytery's relationship with the Covenant Network, and that is a gift. To have been part of that story really from the beginning is an absolute gift and is embedded throughout our work and our life together. And also, it cannot just be our history. And so part of the reason for this conversation is for us to think about what comes next. What is the next phase? What is the next stage? What is the next challenge? What is the next hope? What is the next goal? What is the next aspect of this work that we get to do together to further God's work in the world, to further God's justice in the world, and to be part of that together? When I came into this presbytery in February of 2020, which is a literal other thing, this presbytery embarked on a process of self-assessment related, ma'am, no, thank you, related to equity, to anti-racism, to better understanding who we are. And as you can imagine, what was meant to be about a one-year project became much more than that because everything changed. So when I came into the presbytery 2 years ago, honey, do you want to go with Auntie Marcy? Yeah. May the Lord bless our village. When I came into this presbytery, we were in the process of writing up and finalizing that report. And that report and the recommendations contained within it are the benchmark now by which we do our work. In an effort to be equitable, to be not racist, but to be actively anti-racist, to understand our presence in this particular part of the world, the ways that we interact with our neighbors and its particular challenges, and the ways that we talk about justice and the ways that we talk about inclusion. And so while we are in partnership with the Covenant Network as it pertains to the full inclusion of LGBTQIA folks, this is also part of our conversation around anti-racism. And to that end, I want to introduce you to another staff member and a great friend of the Presbyteries, an inquirer, in fact, toward ordination. Their story is a little bit complicated because all of our ordination stories are a little bit complicated. But I am glad to introduce the Reverend Ana Kendig Flores, who serves as anti-racism coordinator for the Presbytery, and Dr. Jimmy Hoke, who serves at the House of Hope Presbyterian Church and is also offering a workshop today. And they're going to sort of lay the foundation a little bit more than I am on how we are doing this and what we are inviting as part of this conversation. So Ana and Jimmy. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I am Ana Kendig Flores, and I am the anti-racism coordinator for the Presbytery. And I just wanted to say that since 2016, the Presbytery of the Twin Cities area has been doing this work. And then the assessment process, yes, did take a minute or three. But we are in the implementation phase of that work, and the implementation phase will be forever. It's not just 5 years, it's not just 5 minutes. And so we know the same thing is true as we were hearing, right? That there is always something more to do to help us grow in more deeper community. So this is always intersectional work, and we've been committed to that for years. But this gathering, this partnership, we normally host anti-racism gatherings every spring and fall. And so we partnered together for this event. So you'll hear the anti-racism piece showing up, I'm sure, in a lot of ways in your conversations, but I hope you'll hear two specifically. One is the focus on naming and considering intersectionality, which Jimmy and I will talk about in a moment, no matter who is in the room. And I think that's really important to notice, that intersectionality is representation, but it's not only representation. It's also about how we think and how we shape our conversations and think about who isn't present and how we can bring those voices and that wisdom and that lived experience forward. And the other piece is process observation. And so this is a practice that the Anti-Racism Task Force in this Presbytery has been using in our stated meetings. And this time we're going to do it via the anti-racism spiritual capacities. There's 4 of them. There's 14 of them, but we're going to only use 4 today because, we don't want to overdo it. And many of you will recognize these from the pilgrimage that we did in 2020 through 2022. So you can learn more about what these spiritual capacities are and consider how you are embodying or spotting them as we have conversations together. There's copies on the registration table. They look like this. So please feel free to learn more about how we've been using these here among us. And now a word about intersectionality specifically.
All right, so what is intersectionality? In brief, it is grounded in the legal work of Kimberly Crenshaw, a name that may be familiar to some. She originally called attention to how racism and sexism intersect to negate the experience of Black women, and as a result, more than doubled, and I want to emphasize this, more than doubled, even though it's 2 forms of oppression, their experience of oppression. So intersectionality calls our attention to the layered identities we carry that make us unique, including race, gender, sexual orientation, disability and age, but also class, primary language, documentation status, and more.
And I think the key that we want to just recognize with intersectionality is that it has to do with more than just sort of naming one's different identities, any one person's layers of identity, but it's about how those identities relate to systems of power. And those things, those systems of power are rooted in social constructs of things like race and gender and more. So we're always needing to be thinking about power and how is it moving in the conversations we're having. It brings to light the connection between our social identities and our personal identities, alongside how all of that plays out in the context of, again, those power and systems. And so we just want to name that, as Jimmy and I were talking about this, we were sort of wrestling with how do we name this in a short fashion, because we could have a whole conference just on intersectionality and what it is and what it isn't. the things that we were sort of thinking about is like, what isn't intersectionality? And what intersectionality isn't is it's not math. It's not a formula. It's not 1 + 2 + 3 + 1, right? It's not that. It is about the different pieces of who we are, but it's not a formula. It's also not a hierarchy. Yes, the systems of power do matter, but it's not about either reversing a hierarchy or reinforcing a hierarchy by only talking about things in really static ways. It's a matrix of meaning and power. And also, it is also not a way to make people feel badly about who they are on one side or the other, right? Either because maybe you might embody multiple areas of marginality, or you may embody multiple areas of privilege or social dominance, right? That's not a shame thing. It's a thing that we just live in together. It's the soup that we're a part of. And when we talk about it and be more honest about it, it can become a healthier thing.
So what can we shift, both today as we go through the plenary, as we think in our workshops, as we have conversations, but also as we go out from here, especially if we don't currently have many or any participants or community members who might embody the experiences we're talking about. First, our starting point should always place the experiences and needs of intersectionally marginalized people at the center. This means examining our starting assumptions. What do we assume around who we are and who we are seeking to include and center? If we, either leaders or participants, are picturing the queer community as primarily white or primarily gay or lesbian, this already is distorting how we're thinking about the conversation, how we come to the conversation, how we participate. How can we help people, including ourselves, broaden our assumptions while being realistic about people who will most likely engage with our spaces and who is already among us? And then the second thing is we can be willing to sit with tensions of multiple overlapping conversations at the same time. When intersectionality is not math, that means it gets really, really messy. And sometimes, right, when you have multiple experiences of oppression that are vast and diverse, people are going to disagree or just say things differently. And we have to sit with that tension instead of feeling that need to solve the problem immediately. When we allow ourselves to be in conversations where the overlaps are allowed to have space and room to breathe, it may surface long-standing tensions or dynamics, finding ways to work creatively with the tension rather than smothering it can be powerful.
So as we think about the conversation we're going to have today, I think one of the things we want to acknowledge as the Presbytery of the Twin Cities area is that in this room or in the entire Presbytery, we are not a full embodiment of the kingdom of God, right? It's obvious to know that, but it sometimes can be forgotten in the way we have our conversations. Specifically, we are missing broader representation from Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. The goal is not to tokenize the experiences of folks who have multiple marginalizations, but to instead let ourselves be transformed by better listening and deeper understanding of how we can be healthier spaces. So intersectionality challenges us to notice who or what is missing in the conversation and how it affects our conversations and our conclusions. It allows us to acknowledge these gaps without discounting the space that we do have, the people who are here, the intersectionalities that are absolutely within and among each and every one of us, but still seeking to move beyond the obvious and seeking repair where harm might be done and drawing the circle wider as we deepen this conversation. So I hope that we ultimately hear that as a word of complexity, certainly, but also as a word of hope. I think that as I do this anti-racism work in this presbytery, along with great partners like Jimmy and so many others, it's just amazing to see how the work kind of blossoms in all the ways that it shows up. So looking forward to having this conversation with all of you and inviting you to pick up the spiritual capacities that are on the table and keep thinking about how you can be a part of bringing other elements into the room as we are together. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna and Jimmy and Libby and Matt. We really are blessed by the opportunity when we have these events in such close partnership with the presbytery, with the community that is going to live out whatever steps toward transformation we work on and try to commit to this day. And so thank you all for investing in this, the ongoing growth of this community and this presbytery in this particular way this morning. We're going to have a plenary panel discussion now that tries to sort of explore the themes of this day. I'm going to invite the participants in the panel to come forward. There are chairs up on the chancel for you all. And Lisa, I'm here if you want to. Thank you. I will walk with you up to the steps and one of our, great. Our board member, Alex Vise, was not feeling well this morning, and I thought he might make it in time for the panel, but he isn't. Maybe he will join us before it is over. I am delighted to introduce the group of people behind me. The panel is called What's the Next Step? That's a vague title, one that could go a lot of directions, but it does speak to what we're hoping comes from this day. Every congregation, every person who seeks to strengthen their welcome and the authenticity of their message and their practice is on a journey. No one has it completely figured out. So I get calls from churches that have had a rainbow flag outside their church for 10 years, but they still aren't feeling like they know what to do next. I get calls from churches that say, I'm afraid I'm going to get shouted down in the pulpit if I say the word gay. What do I do next? All of us have to kind of ask that question of what's the next step. And we wanted to gather this panel of experienced church leaders. Brian, why don't you come closer to the
You're so far away.
to talk about their experience of taking steps along the way of this journey. And all of them have had profoundly different journeys and yet maybe find some commonalities as well. I want to start with Lisa Largis, who is a parish associate at Lake Nokomis Presbyterian Church, was involved with That All May Freely Serve back from 2002 to 2012. A resume doesn't really capture Lisa and her importance and significance as a pioneer and a person willing to put themselves out there in the journey that the Presbyterian Church as a whole has been on in living into our growth as a church that is now more affirming than it once was. Lisa is someone who I got to meet a decade ago when I first started this job, and who's been an important piece of an inspiration to me and to a lot of other people. So I'm really honored to have Lisa as part of this panel. Lisa, I want to start with you and ask, you have been part of this conversation in the church for a while. How have you, how is the experience different today than it was 10, 20 years ago? And what hasn't changed?
Let's see.
Oh,
There's a button. I think it is on.
is it-
All right.
there you
Yeah,
go.
there we go. All right, thanks. How just sweet to be here. So, and thank you. Thanks for the invitation too, and really wonderful to be with this panel too. As I've been thinking about kind of what's on my heart to say to bring to this conversation and in response to Brian's question, just a couple of fundamentals to ground us in, and first just a quick word about what we've been through together. Which is to say that the process that we went through as a denomination to get to where we are now it was necessarily a cumbersome one. We come out of a tradition that uses Robert's Rules of Order as its deliberative process, you know, and that and other parts of the way that we have worked together to make decisions together, you know, obviously have many things to commend them, and at the same time can be incredibly dehumanizing, bludgeoning of folks, which is just to say that it was a painful process. Certainly, it was a painful process for me, right? But more than that, for folks coming up, and that experience of seeing the way that we as a church wounded beautiful people, young people in the church and their families, not something I want to do again, you know? So as I think about kind of where we are now, lots of those deliberative processes are still in place, even though we're working on changing them. But, you know, looking forward to the next church fight, you know, whatever that's going to be. Can we do it different, you know? Can we not do it on the backs of people? Can we sort of work on changing kind of our deliberative processes in some way that will make it more humane and model to the world something that might be possibly a little more godly? Don't know. And just quick before I turn it on to the other beautiful people up here, you know, that process that we went through in the church, you know, laid the foundation to, it was part of what laid the foundation to where we are politically in this country today. You know, we've been a part of that complex history in lots of ways. But it was a process that kind of spiritually speaking, denigrated my belovedness, you know, and denigrated the belovedness of queer folks and our families, and kind of the spiritual strength that queer folks found because of that is affirming our belovedness. And, you know, change happened, I like to think, because there were processes by which queer folks and our allies refused to let go of our belovedness, and also insisted on the belovedness of the people who work to denigrate our lives, right? And so, like, by creating relationships, things changed. And so, how do we bring that to where we are now? How do we bring those spiritual practices? And then the last thing I want to say is just kind of the ongoing importance of confession, you know. For me personally, like, acknowledging my own privileges and my own complicit part in who we are together just requires a certain amount of humility. And so learning that humility together is another part of what keeps me interested in churchy things. So that's what I got.
Thank you, Lisa. I want to, there's a lot of those questions I want to follow up on, but let's introduce the other members of the panel. I want to come back to a couple of things. But speaking of that voting, that parliamentary process, the way we made decisions, the way we had the debate, I want to turn to Slats. Slats Toole is co-moderator of the board of the Covenant Network of Presbyterians, lives here in the Twin Cities, and graduate of Princeton Seminary. You were in seminary during some of those difficult years of conversation. One of the things that strikes me, Slats, is that when it came to sexual orientation and the ordination of gay and lesbian people, we had a lot of debates and votes. That's how Presbyterians talk about things. They find something to vote on and argue about. We didn't actually have votes on gender identity, on the inclusion of trans people in the church. There wasn't an explicit prohibition like G60106B that dealt with gender identity. And yet, we would not say we were an affirming church with regard to diverse gender identities. The exclusion took a different form, and our efforts to be inclusive today may need to take a different path as well. I wonder if you could talk about the ways gender identity and trans and non-binary identities in today's church are also on that journey when it's not a polity journey.
Excellent question. Hello, Slats, they, them pronouns. I live in Minneapolis, having moved here in 2020. Great time to move. And currently live, that area of Hennepin and Lake that has all the construction right now. That is where I live. And when you ask this, I'm actually remembering the first time we met, which I'm not sure if you remember. But you were speaking at Nassau Presbyterian Church in Princeton. I ran back. I was doing field education in another church, and I heard that Brian Ellison from the Covenant Network was going to be at Nassau, and I ran back and caught the very tail end of the kind of after-church discussion.
That's the first time anyone's ever run to hear me speak.
And now I'm co-moderator of the board. So, and I came in and I said, do you have any resources around gender identity? And you were very honest and said, not really. I can point you to some that aren't, through Covenant Network, but we haven't spent a lot of time with this, and we know we need to. And I feel like that encapsulates a lot of where the church kind of is right now. When I was growing up, the existence of gay people was said to be a somewhat rare thing, right? There was occasionally people you found who were gay. Bisexuality did not exist when I was in elementary school, apparently. But it was so rare. And what we've seen throughout the time that we've been having these conversations as the church is that it's not as rare as we thought it was, but people had not felt safe to say who they were. And as culture started to shift, we saw the church push back against that. We were not originally a church that explicitly barred gay and lesbian people from serving in ordained ministry, and then the church pushed back and brought in language that specifically barred that. Luckily, as we know, we've moved past that language, not without a fair amount of hurt, not without people leaving. And now we're seeing kind of a cultural shift, I think in a similar way, around gender identity. I did not figure out my gender identity until I was in seminary. This was not because of seminary, maybe in spite of seminary, but simply because I did not have the language. Just as when I was a kid, I didn't have the language of being attracted to people of all genders, which left me very confused as a fifth grader. I didn't have language around gender identity outside this male-female binary. And when I started to meet people who identified as non-binary, as genderqueer, my first reaction was, oh, that's wonderful, I can be a great ally. That is absolutely not me, not at all. Don't think about that too hard. Eventually, as I realized that meant I needed to think about that much harder, and a lot of things from my life started falling into place and making sense, I realized the church was not prepared at all to have that conversation. We've done specific work around particularly lifting up women. I think that work is not done. I'm seeing many folks with a more feminine presentation nodding at that right now. But the result of that has also been that I was finding myself placed in these kind of binary categories in a way that didn't suit me. I've never tried to go to like churches that don't deem themselves welcoming. Like I'm not trying to go where I know I'm not wanted. But still, I would be at churches that would say, I came back to a church and it was the assurance of pardon. Mm-hmm. And they said, brothers and sisters in Christ. Or more often sisters and brothers in Christ, because they were progressive enough to put women first, which appreciated. And I kind of sat there like, oh, that's not me. I would really love to be included in the assurance of pardon of all things, because Lisa was so right, we need confession and we need that assurance that we are still beloved. And there were some people on staff who saw me there on the end were like, oh gosh, yeah. And I do that too, right? If I'm leaving a group out or using language in a way that I didn't realize puts down a group of people, and then I see someone from that group in the space, it sinks in a way that it didn't before. And then the next week, the language was still there. And the next week, the language was still there. And then I knew there were some conversations happening in staff meetings about it, and the language was still there. And I eventually went to the pastor after a couple months, who I knew was in charge of liturgy, and I said, look, I'm really struggling. We could say, sisters, brothers, and all siblings in Christ. Mm-hmm. And that pastor said, oh, I know, we know it's a problem. We're going to change it at Advent. Which I've been to seminary. I'm a liturgical nerd. I know that if you're trying to sneak something past a congregation, you do it at the change of a liturgical season so that it can be explained away by, oh, it's Advent, we're doing new liturgy. Which meant that instead of having the conversation of, oh yeah, we did change this, and here's why we changed this, they were willing to let someone like me, and who knows who else was in that space or not coming into that space because of that, bear that burden instead of have those conversations. The unexpected benefits of having these polity barriers is that we've had to have those conversations. I get asked when states pass terrible laws, I am more likely to be asked by people in those states, oh, what can we do? Because we see this as terrible. We see this as not right. But if that external force isn't happening, it is much harder for churches to feel, oh, we must respond. So my kind of prayer and hope for the church is that we see what's happening culturally. We see the kids who are struggling in schools because the school doesn't know how to handle it at best. Governments are actively against it at worst. And we say this is a way that we can respond and be proactive in welcoming folks of all gender identities, even though we don't have this polity hanging over our heads.
Thanks, Lance.
You're welcome.
You've alluded to the fact that this conversation takes place on the national level of the church, but also on the congregational level in the day-to-day decisions that a congregation makes. And I want to turn to Brian. Brian Entz is pastor at the Buffalo Presbyterian Church. Is it Buffalo Presbyterian Church? In Buffalo. I've known Brian for many years, and I know that your journey toward pastoral ministry has been a journey. But I also know that you've walked with a congregation that exists in a place that is, this may be a progressive presbytery, but not every community in the presbytery is progressive. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about when it comes down, not to a big national debate, but how you as a community are going to live into the reality of trying to bear a faithful, inclusive witness in a place that isn't always open to that. What are the things that have stood out to you as part of what that's about, and what decisions you have to make to have the courage to be transformed in that way?
Yeah, so I've been at Buffalo 7 years, and they were they were affirming when they hired me, because they hired a bi-queer pastor, and they had already accepted a young adult in the congregation who was coming out as trans at the same time as being on the session in the congregation. So it's not like we had to have all the basic conversations. The culture was generally affirming and welcoming, but you wouldn't know that if you looked at the church's website. You wouldn't know that if you drove by the building. You wouldn't know that if you walked in, unless you started having conversations with people, unless you started getting to know people. Then maybe, because somebody over here would mention that their son is gay, or somebody over here might mention that their grandson is gay, and then all of a sudden the affirmation starts to bubble to the surface. But the problem is that for Presbyterians and other Christians, right, so many people have been burned by churches, they don't even want to step foot in any church. And so part of the process, and it's an ongoing process, has been, so how do we let people know that if you come here, we're not going to tell you that you need to repent of being gay, or that it's wrong that you're trans, or that you shouldn't support your child because she's a lesbian. And so part of that process began with using a video of a talk that Brian had given. I don't know that it was a previous covenant conversation, but sharing that with the session and talking about why certain things like displaying, proclaiming your welcome and affirmation is important. And then it led on to some conversations at the session level, also more conversation, and some of the people in the congregation honestly said, why are we still talking about this? We talked about this when the church was debating marriage several years ago. Like, let's just do it. And at the same time, there were other people in the congregation who weren't quite ready for this because they aren't personally affirming, and they're still not. But they also appreciate being part of a congregation where there's a diversity of thought and not everybody's going to agree with them. And so we've had to kind of broach that process and bridge the people who are like, why do we have to talk about this still? Let's just put the rainbow flag up and keep going. And then the people who don't like the rainbow flag. But we got to the place where we put the pride flag up, and it got stolen several times, and thanks to various people in the congregation and the community and the presbytery who've helped us replace those flags. And now it's high up on a light pole in the parking lot, so if you want to steal it, you've got to put a little more effort in. But somebody still put the effort in this summer at the opening night of the rodeo, which is down the road from the church. But now there's a flag out, and now there's a welcome statement on the website, and so, beginning efforts have been made. We've had a presence at the Wright Sherburne County Pride Festival the last 2 years. And so it's step by step, a process. And there's still a lot of work to be done. And some of it costs a lot of money, like bathroom renovations so that we can have a gender-neutral bathroom.
And that is, for many churches, the honest barrier and or the excuse for not taking steps. I want to actually pick up where Anna and Jimmy left off in their opening question to us, their comments to us, with the matter of intersectionality, the reality that our work combating exclusion, combating discrimination, combating racist or homophobic or transphobic behaviors operates on layers that are always intersecting. And I want to ask you about that. I mean, one of the realities is that various contexts, cultural contexts, ethnic contexts, contexts of communities that are more conservative, are going to be at play, and you have to figure out how to interpret and translate a conversation about inclusion into layers of community. How have you seen that done? What are practical ways that churches that want to really not back away because it's hard, what do you encourage them to do? What should be guiding their thinking about having a genuinely authentic intersectional approach to inclusion? And I'm going to let them think about that for 5 seconds while I turn to you and say, you can ask questions of this panel. So if you have questions in mind, think of them. I will come to you with a microphone in a minute.
I can start us off. Like Lisa, I am a very much it's weird to say a fan of confession. But I appreciate what Matt said about we're always striving for better inclusion. We know, we already have the language in our tradition to know that we are not going to get everything right all the time. And I know for me and a lot of communities I've been in, the thing that keeps us from getting better is our fear that we're not going to be perfect. We're really afraid of messing something up. And I see this a lot in, I've often taught like kind of gender identity 101 classes. And most people who come to those people aren't going to be combative about the idea of gender identity, but have not engaged because they're so afraid of saying something wrong. They're so afraid of using the wrong language. And we know that we're gonna mess up. We're gonna say things that's not reflective of who we want to be as children of God and as the body of Christ. And so I think if we are able to enter into these conversations with the expectation, yeah, we're gonna fall short, and that is going to be an opportunity to learn, and we are going to listen when we hear that we have hurt someone, and we're going to take a moment to breathe and be in our bodies a little bit instead of letting that nervous system that wants to defend ourselves and say, oh, well, that's not what I mean, and you know I'm not racist, and you know I love gay people. That happens, knowing that those reactions are going to come up. And that is part of this work that we're doing together. We are imperfect people trying to be a little bit better than we were the day before. And so grounding ourselves in that theology and that rootedness and allowing that to transform us has been, as I think, essential for the base layer of those conversations.
Anyone want to add to that? Very well. No, go ahead, Brad.
I think one place that the intersections conversation showed up in my congregation is the very practical conversation around bathrooms, because not only do we recognize we only have a multi-stall women's room and a multi-stall men's room, but then we were going about a accessibility audit that is probably inadequate because it's 20 years old, but that's the tool that Presbyterians have at the moment. And we realized that, our supposedly handicap accessible bathrooms aren't. The countertop's not high enough. The door to the handicap stall might be wide enough, but the latching mechanism can't be locked and unlocked with a closed fist. And once you get in there, there's not enough room for the wheelchair or the walker next to the toilet with the door to the stall closed. So it's not as accessible as we'd like to think. And so then it brings up, now we have a whole host of needs, all of which would meet people in our context already. We already have a trans non-binary person in our congregation. We already have people using walkers and wheelchairs and canes in our congregation. This doesn't even have to be a hypothetical what if somebody walked in off the street. And so it's already about caring for our folks, and it's also another way to communicate to people when they step into our building, whether it's for something we're doing or whether they're there for an AA meeting or they're picking up their kid from Girl Scouts, that all of a sudden they can realize here's a very visible way to know that I'm welcome, and that some of those very practical ways that we can express welcome and affirmation are gonna be intersectional, because they're going to cover multiple things, even if we don't think about it at first. And so how are the pathways and the processes and the things we do ultimately intersectional, even if we go about it at first because of one topic or issue?
Well said. Lisa?
I guess the only couple of quick things I would add in, I'm not sure if this is working or not. What do you think?
Let me
Is
see.
Lisa's mic on?
Let me.
Just want to make sure Lisa's mic is on. Okay.
I
You're
do
fine, I think.
sound at other places, so.
There's a button on the bottom.
There you go.
There it is.
All right. Yeah, there we go. Just a couple of quick things. One is that, like the queer movement as a whole, within the Presbyterian Church, the queer movement has been dominated by folks who are predominantly white, right? And so we've shaped the conversation. We've determined kind of what's allowed and not allowed, and all of that. And so we, again, we've been we've limited the scope of expression in lots of ways that have been incredibly detrimental to ourselves and to our movement. And then the other thing is, I just want to say, we didn't invent identity politics. Black folks didn't invent identity politics. Queer folks didn't invent identity politics. Our systems of discrimination and oppression forced folks to say, I'm not going to be treated in this way, and so I'm going to claim my identity, right, and not be erased from history. So, as we kind of figure out like how to work intersectionally, embracing who I am as a disabled person and a queer person, like obviously those aren't separate within me, and yet the way that we work in our culture has kind of created this thing about identities, which is obviously clearly important, right? But it's only important within that history of oppression and discrimination. So anyway, that's what I would add.
Really appreciate that. We do have time for some questions. I can ask more questions. They're okay questions, but yours might be better. So I'd love to hear what you have. I'm going to get this other microphone and bring it to you. Is this microphone okay to use as well? All right, there's a red light on there.
Hi, I'm Jonathan. I'm a staff.
John, before you go, I just want to mention the crowd. We are live streaming. We weren't sure we were going to be able to do that, but we are live streaming. So don't say anything you don't want on the internet. Okay. Go ahead.
I'm on a staff member and ordained elder at a small Presbyterian church in St. Peter. The topic is next steps. I feel like it might be helpful to first look at where we are currently, because I'm not sure we're all starting from the same current location. So what the next step is might be different depending on where you are. So baseline, how many churches in the PCUSA would be comfortable ordaining a gay, lesbian elder right now, today? What percentage of churches in the PCUSA would be comfortable ordaining a gay or lesbian pastor? What percentage ever have ordained a gay or lesbian elder? Don't talk about gender identity. How many churches in the PCUSA have ever installed a pastor who's not a man? My church hasn't. So non-binary is great, but we got a few other barriers we haven't crossed yet. Can anybody help sort of look at where we are?
This is a great question, and our panelists may have some insight into that. Let me take a first shot at it. One of the things I will tell you is that a congregation declaring itself to be affirming does not necessarily mean an answer yes to any of the questions you just asked. Whether it actually has done those things, has had the opportunity to do those things. I also can't give you exact numbers because the General Assembly, the Presbyterian Church, does not collect those numbers. They do with regard to whether you've invited someone of a gender other than your pastor to the pulpit, and also race other than your pastor, or that is not the majority, but they don't ask about LGBTQ representation yet. But here's anecdotally what I believe to be the case. When I'm a mid-council leader as well. I'm a stated clerk of a synod, and I've gone to gatherings and tried to intentionally ask my colleagues how many of their presbyteries have installed LGBTQ pastors in their presbytery. And I believe that now, 13 years after the policy change, that we still have fewer than half of our presbyteries with an installed LGBTQ pastor. I used to say fewer than a third, and a few more have come online since I was saying that. And then others have some in sort of invalidated positions, members of presbytery. That is what I'm saying. At least one. I'm saying more than half of our presbyteries don't have even one. That they're aware of. Yeah. Correct. And that's the other reason that's a hard question to answer. That's exactly right. And this is, the Covenant Network of Presbyterians, we do events like this, but a lot of what we do, I can't really show you because it's me answering my phone or reading my email. It's people calling and asking for help and saying, I'm queer and it's time for me to come out to my congregation, but I don't think it's safe for me to do that. Or I'm looking for a new call. Is this a safe place for me to search out because I'm not out now? And that is happening a lot. And this is 13 years after the policy has changed. So these questions are almost impossible to answer because the realities of the church are that we are not nearly as inclusive and not nearly as far down the road as we want to believe we are. Mm-hmm. And it's why even those of us who identify as sort of progressive or as inclusive, or even the ones doing this work professionally, have to continue to not celebrate our progress in a way that suggests the work is done. Others want to comment on that? Your observations?
Kind of going off what you were saying about the Covenant Network, I was not on the board at the time, but after major policy changes in the PCUSA, the board of the Covenant Network had some pretty intense conversations about, do we continue to exist? Are we done? Did we do it? There were some folks who were like, I was in here for this fight, and that's what I had the energy for, which we totally respect and thank them for their service. And then there was also a group that said, this doesn't necessarily mean that things are changing for churches on the ground. And that is why I love these kinds of events, and we've really shifted our focus to be less national organizing, because we don't need to do as much of that, to local work, because that is where the work is really, really needed now, is on a presbytery level, is on an individual congregational level, which is different than what a lot of us who've been in this for a while have experienced. It's, I think, an exciting shift, because we did make some serious, serious progress. And now it's this kind of work. It's that community work that's actually going to make it so that we have a better answer with those numbers.
Thank you. I'm wondering about, in terms of how do we educate people past the hostility of expanding the language of inclusion? Like the hostility towards, you've heard the pejorative term, alphabet mafia, you know, and the hostility towards the ever evolving term, you know, LGBTQIA or LGBTQ2S or plus. There's, yeah, how do we educate people past that hostility? And it's not just, you know, about LGBTQ issues, it's about other issues and questions of inclusion, and how do we educate people past that barrier?
Great question, thank you.
I feel like I've spoken a lot, so if somebody else wants to.
I mean, I don't know that it completely absolves the hostility some people have, but part of it, I think, is reminding people that we're always talking about people, right? Whether it's an L, a G, a B, a T, a Q, an I, an A. Like, all of those are representative of people. And when we're talking about race, we're talking about people. When we're talking about accessibility needs, we're talking about people. And if people can be reminded of the humanity of others, whether the other people are like them or not, then in that way, hopefully they can get past this almost objectification of people, which makes it a lot easier to carry hostility. And so I don't think that completely, you know, takes away from it, but I would start by reminding people that we're talking about other human beings. And in some cases, we might be talking about human beings that you know. You just don't know that she's a lesbian. You just don't know that your grandkid is discerning their gender identity, because maybe they don't feel comfortable talking about it with you.
I do think it's also that, you know, for those of us who have the capacity to do so, to be in deep relationship with folks so that they have space to transform. And, you know, so that begins where, you know, with really, like, the hearing where they are and, you know, hearing past the, we used to say that, you know, irrational fears aren't changed by rational arguments. But I would just say that, you know, fear isn't changed by argumentation. You know, fear is just changed by trust and relationship building and things like that. And so, for those of us who have the capacity to do that, to really be able to be with folks in a different way as we can, without again, without doing that on the backs of the folks in our congregations who are the most vulnerable, right? I mean, we changed the language because that is the way in which we reduce harm. And then we sit with those for whom that feels painful or whatever. pisses people off, whatever, right? Then we sit with those folks and figure out, okay, what's that about for you? I think, the last part I was going to say is, my mentor, J.D. Sparks, he used to always say, are you willing to be curriculum? So, and it's that conscious choice for those of us who are kind of living within a marginal identity. Like, we get to choose when we're willing to be curriculum or not, right? And if you're not, if you don't have that capacity to be curriculum, that's cool, because you're just a human being. You get to be a human being. But it's good for us to kind of share that information with one another, right?
I want to ask the last question here, and the language, I don't think my mic is working very well, so I'm going to use this one now. I have two mics.
Juggle all
Double fisting. I want to ask the last question, and the words for this question actually came from Lisa during our call to talk about this panel. I think it's really the question that certainly has guided the Covenant Network's discernment of its mission, and also, I think, every congregation that's honestly struggling with what to do. The question, the way you put this, Lisa, and it's actually kind of the same question two different ways. How do we hold on to the radical nature of our faith and bring as many people as we can along on the journey? And you asked it, I think, the opposite question, but really the same question. How can the church become a depolarizing agent without sacrificing our theology? Mm-hmm. So let's end with any of you who want to respond to that in, 25 words or less. How can we do both things? Be bold theological proclaimers and bring people along?
One thing that I want to start with is that kind of when I was coming along, we in the church used to do this really dumb thing, which is we would get both sides, like we'd get the queers on one side and then the folks who opposed ordination and marriage on the other, as if those were two equal sides, even though one didn't have voice and vote, blah, blah, blah. And as if, anyway, there was a lot that was really problematic with that. And I think in this country, we do the same thing. It's like we sort of bring a pox on both your houses kind of thing, like both sides, blah, blah, blah. And it's not that we're not all human and sinful and contribute to the breakdown within our culture. It's just that the way we reach across those boundaries isn't by kind of creating a debating parlor, right? And so if the church can model what it is to create change through relationship, through again recognizing the belovedness of each person, and because we recognize that belovedness in each of ourselves, we hold each other accountable. Again, how can the church be a model for doing that? Yeah, I'll turn it over to either of you to take us out.
I think relationship is absolutely the key, and I think I think right now in the larger church context, relationship is something, and particularly relationship that can be across different realms, relationships across class, relationships across race, relationships across the kinds of work that's done. That's something that the church can hold in a way that a lot of other areas of our culture aren't set up to do. Do we always do that? No. Can we? Absolutely. And I know every time I've seen people's hearts shift, it's been through relationship. This does mean that, I love that phrase of if you're willing to be curriculum, that does mean that it's sometimes on the backs of folks, which is why I think it's great to engage with organizations that are doing this work. Like, I can come into this covenant conversation, and I'm like, I am curriculum today. People can ask me whatever they want to about gender identity. I might say, that's maybe not quite the question to ask, and here's why, but, you know, I'm able to be in this space knowing that I'm prepared for that. It's much harder for me if I'm just going about my day. I'm just at worship and somebody's like, so can you explain the mechanics of gender identity to me? And I'm not in the space to do that. And so being able to create spaces where maybe someone comes in and can be the first non-binary person who your church knows that they've met, that can then create space for that teen to say, here's what I've been thinking about. To have spaces for people to process. When I was starting the process of coming out, I would, if at all possible, I'd come out in a group, so that then those people would have that experience and they could talk to each other about it. We can create spaces where we're helping people process, whether that be about gender identity, sexuality, race, where we can do that work that we need to do, that sometimes we need to do a little bit internally, right? So that we can be our best selves in relationship to others. I always say that you don't have to fully understand to show respect and care. And I think most people can get behind that idea. No pressure.
I think a big part of it is I don't sense that our culture is very good at holding tension. And so if we can learn to hold tension in the midst of things, and the tension might be that a certain person is saying really, really harmful and hurtful things, and they are also a human being created in the image of God. And I think the church, we have a lot of tools in our faith and our theology to help us lean into tension. We hold the tension of God being 3 in 1, and a lot of people are still confused by it, but it's something that we haven't stopped confessing. We hold the tension every week in confession and an assurance of pardon that yes, we have sinned, and also we are forgiven, we are beloved of God. We have tools in our theological tool belt that we can lean into to help us practice holding tension, and if we can learn to hold tension in conversations, in spaces, in communities, then maybe that is an element towards a more depolarized future.
Amen? Amen. Could we say thank you to Brian Entz, Lisa Largis, and Slats Tool? Thank you. We're going to wrap up the plenary time by taking a look at the rest of the day. So if you have your little bulletin handout that looks like this, let's talk through what's happening here today. In a moment, I'm going